The CEO had spent 25 years burying one black woman's name, but the moment her son walked into his boardroom alone, every lie that built his empire began to shake. Richard Whitmore was standing at the head of a glass conference table on the 42nd floor of Whitmore Holdings, smiling like a man who had never lost anything he could not buy back. Outside the windows, Atlanta glittered beneath the late afternoon sun. Inside, 12 board members waited for him to sign the largest acquisition deal of his career, a deal worth more than $2 billion, a deal meant to secure his legacy before retirement. The room smelled of polished wood, leather chairs, expensive coffee, and quiet obedience. Everyone there knew Richard liked silence when he spoke. He had built a life where people nodded before he finished sentences, where lawyers cleaned up problems, where money made memory flexible, and where the past stayed buried if enough powerful men agreed not to dig. Then the boardroom doors opened. A young black man in a dark tailored suit stepped inside carrying a single black folder. He came without security, without an assistant, without any visible fear. His posture was straight, his expression calm, and his eyes moved across the room with the discipline of someone who had studied every name at that table before ever crossing the threshold. Richard's smile tightened. He did not recognize him. To Richard, Malcolm Carter looked like another ambitious attorney sent by the shareholder fund to slow down the vote, another obstacle in an expensive suit, another young man who would learn quickly that Whitmore Holdings did not bend for outsiders. "This is a closed board meeting," Richard said, his voice smooth but cold. "Who let you in?" Malcolm stopped at the far end of the table and placed the black folder down with deliberate care. "Your shareholders did." A murmur moved through the room. Richard glanced toward his general counsel, who suddenly looked down at her tablet instead of meeting his eyes. Malcolm opened the folder, but he did not rush. He let the silence stretch just long enough for Richard to feel it working against him. "Before this board votes," Malcolm said, "they deserve to know what you did to my mother." Richard's face did not change at first, but one hand tightened around the silver pen he had been holding. "I do not know your mother." Malcolm looked at him then, not with rage, not with desperation, but with 25 years of truth sharpened into control. "You knew her when she cleaned your house in Buckhead. You knew her when she told you she was pregnant. And you knew exactly what you were doing when you paid lawyers to make her disappear." The boardroom went silent. Richard's mouth opened, then closed, and for the first time that afternoon, the man who had spent a lifetime commanding rooms could not find the right words fast enough. Malcolm slid the first document across the table. It was not the final proof. Not yet. It was only the beginning. Because Richard Whitmore had made one mistake 25 years ago that money could not erase. He had underestimated a black maid's dignity, and he had never imagined the son she raised would return with her name, her evidence, and the power to make every person in that room listen. 25 years before Malcolm Carter placed that black folder on the boardroom table, his mother moved through the Whitmore mansion like a woman the rich had trained themselves not to see. Naomi Carter was 24 years old then, an African-American woman with warm brown skin, steady eyes, and a quiet face that revealed less than it carried. Every weekday morning, she arrived at the Buckhead estate before 7 o'clock in a Navy-made uniform, her hair pinned neatly beneath a simple scarf, her shoes polished but worn thin at the edges from walking to the bus stop before sunrise. The house was almost 12,000 square feet of marble floors, crystal chandeliers, imported rugs, and framed family portraits that seemed to stare through her instead of at her. Naomi never complained. She unlocked the service entrance, signed the staff log, washed her hands, and began with the front hall because the head housekeeper insisted the first thing guests saw should look untouched by human effort. That was how the Whitmore family liked everything, perfect, silent, and cleaned. By people whose names they rarely remembered. Naomi dusted shelves filled with awards Richard Whitmore had won for leadership and charity. She polished silver trays used for fundraisers where men in tailored suits spoke about opportunity while stepping around the woman who had prepared the room. She changed linens in bedrooms larger than the apartment she shared with her mother, cleaned fingerprints from glass doors overlooking the pool, and carried laundry down a back staircase so visitors would never have to see a worker crossing the main hall. She did not move slowly, and she did not move carelessly. Every motion had purpose. Fold the towel edge inward. Turn the pillow seam away from the door. Check under the sofa cushions. Photograph the work schedule when it changed. Keep copies of pay stubs. Never sign anything without reading it twice. Naomi had learned discipline from necessity, not privilege. Her mother, Lillian, had worked hotel housekeeping for 30 years and had taught her that people with money often confused service with surrender. Do your work well, Lillian used to say, but never let the uniform convince you that you are less than the person being served. Naomi carried that sentence with her like a hidden spine. She was not at Whitmore House because she lacked dreams. She was there because dreams required tuition, bus fare, medicine, and rent. 3 nights a week, after cleaning bathrooms that smelled of imported soap and rooms no one bothered to thank her for, she rode across Atlanta to a community college campus where she studied anatomy under fluorescent lights, determined to finish nursing school. Her textbooks were kept in a canvas bag behind a shelf in the staff pantry because the head housekeeper, Mrs. Whitcomb, said books made the other maids look distracted. Naomi studied anyway. During 10-minute breaks, she copied medical terms onto index cards and tucked them into her apron pocket. During lunch, she ate peanut butter crackers beside the laundry machines and reviewed notes while the dryers hummed. She was tired most days, but not defeated. There was a difference, and Naomi understood it deeply. The Whitmores did not. To them, she was useful when invisible and inconvenient when human. Richard's wife, Caroline, once handed Naomi a wine-stained tablecloth without looking up from her phone and said, "Be careful with that, it costs more than most people make in a week." Naomi answered, "Yes, ma'am," and cleaned it without letting her face change. Richard's mother, Eleanor, was the only person in the house who sometimes asked Naomi if she had eaten. Naomi brought her tea in the afternoons, adjusted the blanket over her knees, and listened while the older woman spoke about flowers, old Atlanta, and a son who had learned ambition before kindness. Naomi never repeated those conversations. She understood privacy. She understood dignity. And because she paid attention, she understood the house better than the people who owned it. She knew which doors Richard closed when he was angry. She knew which lawyers came through the side entrance after public scandals. She knew which staff members lowered their eyes when certain guests arrived. She knew that Richard Whitmore could fill a ballroom with applause and still make the air in a room turn cold with one glance. In public, Richard was polished, generous, visionary. At home, he moved like the world had been built to clear a path for him. He rarely spoke to Naomi at first except to issue instructions. "That room needs to be reset. Coffee in the study. Tell Mrs. Whitcomb I want the West Wing ready by 6. Naomi answered with respect because respect was her character, not his reward. But she noticed him noticing her. Not in the way a man should notice someone who works in his home, but in the way powerful people notice something they believe cannot challenge them. A pause when she entered the study. A question about nursing school that sounded friendly but came after weeks of pretending not to know her name. A compliment on her intelligence delivered when no one else was near enough to hear it. Naomi did not mistake attention for safety. Her calm was not innocence. She had grown up watching women pay high prices for believing kind words from men who controlled their wages. So she kept boundaries. She kept records. When Richard left a handwritten note asking her to bring documents to the study after hours, she folded it and kept it instead of throwing it away. When his private driver changed her schedule without explanation, she wrote the date in a small notebook. When Mrs. Whitcomb told her Richard had personally approved extra hours on her check, Naomi saved the pay stub. None of it felt like evidence yet. It felt like habit. It felt like her mother's voice telling her that paper remembered what rich people denied. Still, Naomi's life outside the mansion remained simple and honest. She took the bus home after dark, unlocked the doors softly so she would not wake Lillian, reheated soup on the stove, and studied until her eyes blurred. On Sundays, she sang in church with a voice low enough to blend but strong enough to carry when the hymn needed it. She helped elderly neighbors carry groceries, sent $20 to a cousin who needed school supplies, and kept a small envelope in her dresser labeled nursing exam. She wanted a life where her hands healed people instead of cleaning up after people who never saw her. She wanted a white uniform of her own, one earned in a hospital, not assigned in a mansion. The unfairness had not made her bitter. It had made her precise. When Richard Whitmore began speaking to her more often, Naomi did not become flattered. She became careful. She saw the distance between them clearly, his name on buildings, her name on a staff schedule, his lawyers on call, her bus pass in her pocket, his mistakes cleaned by others, her mistakes punished before anyone asked why. That distance was the danger. But danger often entered dressed as concern, and Richard had mastered the costume. He asked about her classes. He praised her work ethic. He said people like her deserved chances, though the phrase people like her landed in Naomi's chest with a weight he did not seem to hear. She remained polite. She remained composed. She remained a woman trying to build a lawful life in a city where money could make wrongdoing look respectable. Years later, Malcolm would understand that his mother had never been weak in that house. She had simply been surrounded. Every polished floor she crossed, every document she kept, every insult she swallowed without letting it poison her, every bus ride to class, every quiet act of responsibility was proof of a strength Richard Whitmore had been too arrogant to recognize. He thought Naomi Carter was invisible because she cleaned the rooms where powerful people met. He never imagined she was watching, remembering, and preserving the small truths that would one day become the beginning of his downfall. Richard Whitmore had learned early that money did not simply buy houses, cars, lawyers, and good tables at restaurants. Money bought versions of the truth. By the time Naomi Carter was cleaning the marble floors of his Buckhead mansion, Richard was already a man who understood how to make the world soften around his mistakes. He was 41 then, tall, silver at the temples before age had earned it, always dressed in tailored suits that made ambition look like discipline. Newspapers called him a visionary. Business magazines printed photographs of him standing beside steel beams, hospital wings, scholarship checks, and smiling children whose names he never remembered after the cameras left. At charity galas, he spoke about opportunity with a warm voice and perfect pauses, telling wealthy donors that greatness required lifting others up. People clapped because Richard Whitmore knew exactly which words sounded generous in public. But inside his own house, away from microphones and polished stages, generosity had rules. It flowed upward toward people who could protect him, sideways toward people who could benefit him, and almost never downward toward the workers who made his life function. Richard had been raised in a family where servants were not called servants, because that sounded impolite, but were treated like furniture that could be replaced if it squeaked too loudly. His father, Charles Whitmore, had built the first family fortune in commercial real estate and taught his son that reputation mattered more than goodness because reputation could be measured, defended, insured, and sold. Goodness was private. Reputation was currency. Richard absorbed the lesson completely. When he became chief executive officer of Whitmore Holdings, he carried himself as if every room owed him its best chair. Senior managers stood when he entered. Assistants adjusted schedules around his moods. Reporters waited outside elevators for one quote. Board members praised his decisiveness, which was the polite corporate word for a man who could remove people without losing sleep. He did not shout often, because shouting suggested a lack of control. Richard preferred quiet pressure. A raised eyebrow during a presentation. A long pause after an employee answered. A soft question that made the person across from him feel suddenly smaller. "Are you sure that is the best you can do?" he would ask, and careers bent under the sentence. That was how his power worked. Not by striking tables, but by making people anticipate punishment before he named it. At home, the same pattern held. Mrs. Whitcomb, the head housekeeper, ran the staff with military precision because Richard expected the house to reflect him, spotless, silent, arranged to flatter his importance. If a glass was misplaced before a dinner party, someone lost hours. If a guest noticed dust on the piano, someone's job became temporary. Richard never had to say the cruelest things himself. He created a household where others carried them out on his behalf. That distance made him feel civilized. If a maid cried in the laundry room, he did not see tears, he saw a management issue. If a driver worked 16 hours and asked for a day off, he did not see exhaustion, he saw unreliable service. If Naomi passed through the back hall with textbooks in her bag, he saw ambition only after he decided it might amuse him. His marriage to Caroline Whitmore was another polished arrangement, photographed often and understood by everyone close to them as a merger of family names. Caroline came from old Atlanta money, the kind that wore pearls to charity breakfasts and spoke of class without ever defining it. She knew Richard had secrets because men like Richard collected secrets the way they collected cuff links, but she also knew the marriage protected both of them. She chaired foundations. He chaired the company. They smiled where they were expected to smile. Their private coldness was hidden behind public elegance. That was the world Naomi entered every morning through the service door. A world where every person had a place, and the lowest place was always expected to be grateful. Richard's board adored the numbers he produced. Under his leadership, Whitmore Holdings expanded from regional real estate into healthcare investments, luxury residential towers, and private facilities for wealthy retirees. He laid off hundreds during restructuring and called it operational discipline. He used shell consulting firms to move inconvenient payments and called it strategic discretion. He hired attorneys who spoke in careful phrases like reputational exposure and personal matter containment. If a complaint came from someone powerful, Richard negotiated. If it came from someone without leverage, he buried it. That was not an accident. It was a system. His closest corporate protector was Elaine Porter, general counsel for Whitmore Holdings, a woman whose loyalty was not emotional but transactional. Elaine did not ask whether Richard had done something wrong. She asked how discoverable it was. His chief financial officer at the time, David Lang, was younger then, bright, ambitious, and still capable of discomfort. David noticed unusual payments occasionally, private expenses routed through vague executive accounts, household settlements filed under consulting adjustments, reimbursements that had nothing to do with company operations. When David asked questions, Richard would smile and say, "Do not confuse noise with risk." David learned to stop asking out loud, but he did not stop noticing. That was the mistake Richard made with people he considered beneath him or dependent on him. He assumed silence meant loyalty. Sometimes silence meant survival. Sometimes it meant memory. Richard's public life grew more impressive each year. He funded a nursing scholarship at a downtown hospital while Naomi studied late at night to become a nurse with no scholarship from anyone like him. He gave speeches about dignity of work while staff members at his mansion ate lunch beside cleaning supplies. He told young executives to value people while refusing to learn the last names of women who washed his sheets. He was not a cartoon villain. He was something more common and more dangerous, a respected man who had learned that society often forgave cruelty when it wore a good suit and donated enough money. That respect made him bold. It made him believe certain lines could be crossed if the person on the other side had no one powerful standing there. Naomi Carter, in his mind, belonged to the category of people who could be managed. She was young, black, working class, employed in his home, caring for a sick mother, trying to pay tuition, and dependent on references from people like Mrs. Whitcomb. Richard understood all of that before he ever spoke to her with warmth. The imbalance was not invisible to him. It was precisely what made him comfortable. When he complimented her intelligence, he did so in private. When he asked about her classes, he made it sound generous, as if attention from him were a gift. When he arranged extra hours on her paycheck, he made sure it passed through someone else first, preserving distance while creating obligation. Naomi's caution irritated and intrigued him. She did not giggle, did not blush, did not become overeager. She answered respectfully and returned to work. Richard was used to people leaning toward him. Naomi's steadiness felt like a door that had not opened when he expected it to. Men like Richard often mistake resistance for invitation, not because they misunderstand the answer, but because they believe persistence should eventually defeat it. He began finding reasons to call her into the study after other staff had left. A misplaced file. A tray of coffee. A question about Eleanor's medication schedule. Small things, always reasonable enough to explain if anyone asked. The handwritten notes seemed harmless. The schedule changes seemed administrative. The extra pay seemed generous. Every step was wrapped in deniability, because Richard Whitmore never walked into wrongdoing without first building a hallway back out. What he did not know was that Naomi kept the notes. What he did not know was that his own household had people with eyes, people like Grace Miller in the kitchen, who had worked for rich families long enough to recognize when attention became danger. Grace had seen powerful men move through service corridors before. She had seen women blamed for the discomfort men created. She had seen truth folded into non-disclosure agreements and locked away behind settlement checks. So when Richard's interest in Naomi became visible to the people paid not to see, Grace quietly told Naomi, "Keep everything that has his handwriting on it." Naomi did not ask why. She understood. Still, Richard believed the world remained his to arrange. He believed Caroline would protect the marriage because scandal would embarrass her too. He believed Elaine Porter could draft silence into legal language. He believed Mrs. Whitcomb would choose the household over a maid. He believed David Lang would keep classifying unusual payments the way he was told. He believed a black woman who entered through the service door could never force her name into the rooms where decisions were made. That belief was the foundation of his cruelty. It was also the flaw that would one day bring him down. Because Richard's power was real, but it was not truth. It was access, money, fear, habit, and the willingness of others to look away. For years, that had been enough. It had won him contracts, loyalty, headlines, and silence. But it had also taught him the most dangerous lesson a man can learn, that getting away with something once means he can get away with it forever. When Naomi Carter finally stood before him with the truth he had created, Richard would not respond as a man confronted by responsibility. He would respond as a man offended that someone he considered powerless had dared to interrupt the life he had already decided he deserved. Naomi Carter discovered she was pregnant on a Thursday morning in late September, in the bathroom of the small apartment she shared with her mother, while Atlanta traffic murmured outside the window and her nursing textbook lay open on the kitchen table to a chapter about prenatal care. For nearly a minute, she simply stood there holding the test in one hand, her reflection pale with shock beneath the buzzing light above the sink. She was 24, working full-time, studying at night, sending money toward her mother's prescriptions, and building a future one careful step at a time. Now everything had changed, but not in the way fear wanted her to believe. She placed one hand over her stomach, closed her eyes, and breathed until the room stopped tilting. Naomi was not reckless. She was not careless. She knew exactly who the father was, and she knew exactly what kind of man he had become when he thought no one important was watching. Still, she did not want war. She did not want scandal. She did not want money thrown at her like a problem being swept from a marble floor. She wanted responsibility. She wanted truth. She wanted the child growing inside her to be acknowledged as a life, not treated like an inconvenience that could be managed by lawyers. That afternoon, Naomi went to work as usual. She arrived through the service entrance, signed the staff log at 6:58, folded towels, changed linens, polished the dining room table, and kept her face composed while her mind moved carefully through what had to happen next. She did not tell Mrs. Whitcomb. She did not tell Grace Miller yet, though Grace looked at her twice from the kitchen doorway as if sensing something had shifted. Naomi finished every task on her list because discipline was the only thing keeping panic from taking the wheel. At 4:30, when most of the day staff had left and rain clouds were gathering beyond the tall windows, Naomi placed the pregnancy test receipt, the clinic appointment card, and one of Richard's handwritten notes inside a small folder in her canvas bag. Then she walked to the study and knocked. Richard Whitmore was inside, seated behind a broad mahogany desk, reviewing documents beside a crystal glass of water and a silver pen engraved with his initials. He did not look up immediately. Men like Richard understood the power of making people wait. Naomi stood just inside the doorway with her hands folded in front of her uniform. "Mr. Whitmore," she said softly. "I need to speak with you." Richard finished reading the line in front of him, marked something with his pen, and only then raised his eyes. "This is not a good time. It is important." Something in her voice made him pause. He leaned back slightly, studying her face as if searching for the problem before she named it. "Close the door." Naomi did, but remained standing. Richard gestured toward the chair across from his desk, not warmly, not kindly, but as a command disguised as courtesy. She did not sit. If she sat, she knew the room would become his room entirely. Standing helped her remember she had come with the truth. Richard's mouth tightened. "What is this about?" Naomi took one breath. "I am pregnant." The silence that followed was not shock at first. It was calculation. Richard did not stand. He did not ask if she was all right. He did not ask how far along she was. His eyes moved once toward the closed door, then back to her. When he spoke, his voice had dropped into the careful tone he used with attorneys. "Who else knows?" Naomi felt the answer land exactly where she had feared it would. "That is your first question." Richard's expression cooled. "It is the most relevant question. I have an appointment tomorrow to confirm everything with a doctor. I have not told the staff. I have not told your wife. I came to you first because you deserve to hear it from me." Richard stared at her for a long moment, then set the silver pen down with deliberate care. "Are you sure it is mine?" The words entered the room like a slap without movement. Naomi's face did not change, but something inside her stepped back from him forever. "Yes," she said. "I am sure." "Naomi." He said her name softly, almost patiently, as if she were a junior employee misunderstanding a memo. "You need to think very carefully about what you are suggesting." "I am not suggesting anything. I am telling you the truth. Truth is not always as simple as people want it to be. This is." His jaw tightened at the calmness in her voice. He had expected tears, pleading, maybe panic. He had expected a woman who could be steered by fear. Naomi's steadiness irritated him because it gave him no obvious place to press. He stood at last, not out of concern, but because he wanted height back on his side. "You work in my home," he said. "You understand what is at stake here." "I understand that I am carrying your child." Richard turned toward the window, looking out at the wet garden as if the view might offer him a cleaner version of the conversation. "I have a family. A board. Shareholders. Thousands of employees whose livelihoods are tied to my leadership. This company is in the middle of expansion. A rumor like this, even an unfair one, could damage people who have nothing to do with your situation." Naomi heard the shift. "Your situation. Not our child. Not my responsibility. Just her problem, made heavier by his reputation." "I did not come here to damage anyone," she said. "I came because this baby deserves honesty." Richard turned back to her, and the polished mask thinned. "Do not use words like deserves as if the world runs on feelings. You are young. You are overwhelmed. There are ways to handle this quietly." Naomi's hands tightened once around the strap of her canvas bag. "Handle it how? We can make sure you are taken care of." "Taken care of means what?" "It means you do not have to make this harder than it already is." He walked around the desk, stopping several feet away, close enough to pressure but not close enough to seem threatening if someone opened the door. Every movement was measured. Every sentence had a hallway back out. You could leave the household with a strong reference. Some financial support. A chance to continue school elsewhere without all this becoming public. Naomi looked at him carefully. So I disappear. Richard exhaled, impatient now. No one said disappear. You did not have to. His eyes sharpened. You need to remember your position. The sentence hung there, dressed as advice and shaped like a threat. Naomi felt fear rise, but she did not let it reach her voice. My position is that I am pregnant and telling the truth. Your position, Richard said, colder now, is that you are an employee making a serious claim against a man whose life you do not fully understand. Naomi lifted her chin slightly. I understand enough. That was the moment Richard stopped trying to sound compassionate. The calm in her face, the refusal to collapse. The quiet certainty that she had a right to speak, all of it offended the part of him that believed power should be obeyed before it was explained. You think because I was kind to you, you can walk into this room and threaten everything I have built? Naomi's voice stayed low. Kindness is not what brought me here. Richard's face hardened. For a second, the public man, the charity speaker, the visionary chief executive officer vanished, and the man beneath him looked at Naomi as if she were a stain on something expensive. Listen to me carefully, he said. You will not speak of this to my wife. You will not speak of this to the staff. You will not create a scene in my home. If you are smart, you will let my people help you before this becomes something that follows you for the rest of your life. Naomi reached into her bag and removed the clinic appointment card, not to hand it to him, but to remind herself that paper remembered. I am going to my appointment tomorrow, she said. After that, I will decide what is best for my child. Richard stared at the card, and for the first time, something like alarm moved across his eyes. Not guilt. Not love. Exposure. Your child, he repeated. Yes, Naomi said. My child. And yours. The room became very quiet. Outside, rain began tapping against the study windows. Richard walked back behind his desk, reclaiming the chair like a throne, but his control had already cracked. Leave the house for the evening, he said. Mrs. Whitcomb will contact you about your schedule. Naomi understood what that meant. She also understood that the conversation had crossed a line he would never forgive her for drawing. She placed the clinic card back inside her folder, turned toward the door, and stopped with her hand on the knob. I came to you respectfully, Richard. He looked up sharply at the use of his first name. Naomi did not apologize. Remember that later. Then she opened the door and stepped into the hallway, where the warm light from the chandelier made the mansion look calm, elegant, and untouched. Grace Miller stood near the far end of the corridor holding a tray she had no reason to be holding. Their eyes met for less. Then a second. Grace looked at the folder in Naomi's hand, then at the study door closing behind her, and her face changed just enough to say she understood. Naomi walked toward the service stairs without rushing. Her heart was pounding, but her steps remained even. Richard had not accepted responsibility. He had not offered protection. He had heard the truth and treated it like a threat to be contained. And because Naomi had not bowed, because she had not begged, because she had not let him define her as a problem, Richard Whitmore made his decision before the rain stopped falling. He would not simply deny her. He would make sure no one believed her. By 8 o'clock the next morning, Naomi Carter's name had already been turned into a problem inside the Whitmore mansion. She had not raised her voice. She had not threatened anyone. She had not spoken to Caroline, the board, the newspapers, or the staff. She had gone home in the rain, sat beside her sleeping mother for nearly an hour, and then placed the clinic card, Richard's handwritten note, and her work schedule inside a manila envelope under her mattress. But Richard Whitmore had spent his life preparing for moments exactly like this, moments when truth threatened comfort, and his first instinct was not to correct the wrong. It was to control the witness. Naomi arrived through the service entrance at 6:59, as she always did, wearing her navy uniform, carrying her canvas bag, and holding herself with the same quiet discipline that had carried her through years of being underestimated. Mrs. Whitcomb was waiting beside the staff log with her arms folded and her lips pressed into a line. She did not say good morning. She did not move aside. "Mr. Whitmore has requested that you report to the breakfast room," she said. Naomi looked past her toward the kitchen, where Grace Miller was slicing fruit with slow, careful movements, listening without turning around. "My shift begins in the East Hall," Naomi said. "Not today." Mrs. Whitcomb's eyes moved down to Naomi's bag as if the canvas itself had offended her. "Leave that here." Naomi kept her hand on the strap. "I keep my schoolbooks with me." "You will not need them." The words were small, but they carried the first blade. Naomi understood then that Richard had not waited. He had already begun building a version of the story where she was unstable, dishonest, and disposable. She placed the bag on a narrow chair near the wall, but she did not unzip it. Mrs. Whitcomb noticed. Her face tightened. "You always were very particular for a girl in your position." Naomi looked at her calmly. "I am particular with things that belong to me." Grace's knife paused for half a second against the cutting board. Mrs. Whitcomb gave a thin smile and led Naomi through the back hallway, past the pantry, past the polished silver cabinet, and into the breakfast room where Richard sat at the head of a long table he did not need. Caroline Whitmore sat near the windows in a cream blouse, reading a magazine with the performative disinterest of a woman who wanted everyone to know she had been told only enough to feel superior. Beside Richard stood Elaine Porter, the company's general counsel, dressed in a charcoal suit and holding a leather folder. A security supervisor named Mr. Haynes stood near the door. Richard had called in witnesses, but not the kind who would protect Naomi. The room smelled of coffee and fresh pastries, but the air had already been poisoned. Richard did not invite Naomi to sit. "Naomi," he said, with a sadness so false it sounded rehearsed, "Mrs. Whitcomb has brought a very serious matter to my attention." Naomi looked at Mrs. Whitcomb, who avoided her eyes. "What matter?" Elaine opened the folder. "There have been concerns about your conduct, your emotional stability, and certain inappropriate claims you appear to be preparing to make against this household." Naomi's face remained still, but her fingers curled once at her side. "I made no claim against the household. I spoke privately with Mr. Whitmore." Caroline finally lowered her magazine. Her eyes traveled over Naomi's uniform, her shoes, her hair scarf, her face, and then stopped with cold dislike. "That was your first mistake." Richard sighed like a disappointed employer. "We are trying to help you before you ruin your life." "I asked for responsibility," Naomi said. "You turned that into something else." The calmness in her voice irritated Richard more than anger would have. Anger could be called hysterical. Tears could be used as proof. But Naomi's steadiness made the lie harder to dress. Elaine slid a document onto the table. "This is a separation agreement. It confirms that your employment ends today due to misconduct concerns and breach of household trust. In exchange for your discretion, Mr. Whitmore is willing to provide a generous final payment and a neutral reference." Naomi did not touch the paper. "What misconduct?" Elaine's expression did not change. "You were seen removing household documents from Mr. Whitmore's study." "That is not true." Mrs. Whitcomb spoke quickly. "You have been taking notes for weeks." Naomi turned toward her. "I take notes for my schedule and my classes." "And you have been asking questions about the family," Mrs. Whitcomb added, her voice gaining confidence now that Richard was watching. "You linger near doors. You make staff uncomfortable." Grace's face tightened in the doorway, but she said nothing yet. Naomi understood the trap. They were not trying to prove a crime. They were creating fog. Enough suspicion, enough shame, enough small accusations piled together until the truth looked messy from a distance. Richard leaned forward. "Naomi, no one wants this to become public. People will ask why a maid was keeping records inside a private home. They will ask what you hope to gain. They will ask whether your story changed after you realized your position here was ending. My position was not ending until I told you I was pregnant. Caroline's magazine snapped shut. Do not say that in my house. Naomi looked at her, not with hatred, but with a tired kind of pity. This house does not change what is true. Richard's face hardened, and for 1 second the mask slipped far enough for everyone in the room to see the offense beneath his composure. Not guilt. Offense. Naomi had spoken plainly in front of his wife, his lawyer, his housekeeper, and his security supervisor. She had not used a title. She had not lowered her eyes. That was when he decided humiliation would do what? Pressure had not. You think truth is enough? Richard asked softly. You think you can walk into a room like this and say anything you want because you are upset? Naomi did not answer. Let me explain something to you, he continued. This family has protected you. Paid you fairly. Allowed you into our home. And now you repay that kindness by inventing a story that could hurt innocent people. There is a child involved, Naomi said. There is no child in this room, Caroline said sharply. Naomi placed one hand lightly over her stomach. There is. The room went still. Caroline looked away first, as if the gesture itself disgusted her. Elaine pushed the agreement closer. Sign the document. Take the payment. Attend to your personal situation privately. No, Naomi's answer was quiet, but it landed hard. Richard blinked once. He was not used to refusal from people whose rent could be threatened by a single phone call. No. I am not signing a lie. Elaine's voice cooled. Refusing this offer will have consequences. So will signing it. The sentence was not loud, but Grace heard it. Mrs. Whitcomb heard it. Richard heard it most of all. His jaw shifted, and the performance of concern disappeared completely. Do you understand how this will look? He asked. A young maid, dismissed for misconduct, suddenly claiming the head of the household fathered her child. Every newspaper in this city would ask what you wanted. Every employer would search your name before hiring you. Every nursing program would think twice before accepting someone surrounded by scandal. Naomi felt each threat as he intended it, not as noise, but as a map of the life he could try to ruin. Her school. Her work. Her mother's medicine. Her unborn child's future. He was not just denying her. He was showing her the walls of the cage he believed she lived in. You are threatening my reputation because I told you the truth, she said. Richard's eyes narrowed. I am warning you about reality. No, Naomi said. You are warning me about what you plan to do. Mr. Haynes shifted near the door, uncomfortable. Richard noticed and raised his voice just enough to make the man straighten. Mr. Haynes. Escort Miss Carter to collect her personal belongings from the staff area. The word escort was polite. The meaning was not. Naomi turned to leave, but Elaine stopped her. Your canvas bag will need to be inspected before you exit the property. Naomi's eyes moved to Richard. You are accusing me of theft now? Richard spread his hands slightly, a gesture for the audience more than for her. Given recent concerns, we have to protect ourselves. Mrs. Whitcomb went to the hallway chair and took Naomi's bag before Naomi could reach it. Grace stepped forward from the kitchen. She has schoolbooks in there. Mrs. Whitcomb snapped, return to your station. Grace did not move immediately. That small hesitation mattered. Richard saw it, and his expression sharpened. Grace, he said, smooth and dangerous, this does not involve you. Grace lowered her eyes, but not before Naomi saw the message in them. I saw. I heard. I will remember. Mrs. Whitcomb unzipped the bag on the breakfast table, as if Naomi's belongings were evidence to be displayed before people who had already chosen a verdict. She removed a nursing textbook, index cards, a lunch container, a folded bus schedule, a worn wallet, and the small notebook Naomi used to track her hours. Elaine picked up the notebook. This appears to contain dates and household references. It contains my work hours, Naomi said. And notes about conversations? Elaine asked. Naomi held her gaze. When powerful people change their stories, dates matter. Richard's face flushed lightly, not with shame, but anger. Caroline stood then, her voice shaking with insulted pride. How dare you come into this family, take our trust, and then behave as if you are some kind of victim? Naomi turned to her. I did my job. You forgot your place, Caroline said. That sentence changed the temperature of the room. Even Mr. Haynes looked down. Grace's hand tightened around the kitchen towel she was holding. Mrs. Whitcomb looked satisfied. Richard said nothing, because Caroline had spoken the truth of the household more plainly than he would have allowed himself to say. Naomi absorbed it without lowering her head. No, she said. I remembered. My worth. Richard stood so abruptly that the chair behind him scraped against the floor. It was not violence, but it was meant to startle. Naomi did not flinch. Her silence was not weakness. Her calm was not fear. It was the last form of dignity available in a room designed to strip it from her. Richard pointed toward the service hallway. You are done here. Mr. Haynes moved toward Naomi, not touching her at first, but standing close enough to block any path except the one Richard wanted her to take. Mrs. Whitcomb shoved the items back into Naomi's bag carelessly, bending the corner of her textbook and scattering several index cards onto the floor. Naomi bent to pick them up. Caroline made a small sound of disgust. Leave them. Naomi picked up every card. One said cardiac cycle. Another said patient rights. Another said document everything. She placed them back into the bag slowly. That patience enraged Richard because it made the room wait for her. Do not test me, he said. Naomi looked up. I am not testing you. I am leaving with what belongs to me. Elaine placed the unsigned separation agreement into an envelope and tried to push it into Naomi's hand. You have 48 hours to reconsider. After that, the offer may be withdrawn. Naomi did not take it. Elaine set it on top of her bag anyway. You should speak to no one about this. I will speak to my doctor, Naomi said. And anyone else I need to protect my child. Richard's voice dropped. If you drag my name into this, I will make sure every door you are trying to open closes before you reach it. There it was. Not hidden behind legal language. Not softened by concern. The threat was clear enough for the room to understand and vague enough for him to deny later. Naomi looked at Mrs. Whitcomb, then Elaine, then Caroline, then Mr. Haynes, and finally Richard. You all heard that. No one answered. But silence was not the same as absence. Grace was still there. David Lang, passing the far hallway on his way to a breakfast meeting with Richard, had paused just outside the open archway long enough to hear the final sentence. He did not enter. He did not defend Naomi. But his expression changed, and years later, that moment would return to him with the weight of a debt. Mr. Haynes walked Naomi through the service corridor. Mrs. Whitcomb followed behind, narrating her shame for the benefit of the kitchen staff. This is what happens when people confuse opportunity with entitlement. A younger maid looked down at her shoes. A gardener outside the mudroom stared at the floor. Grace stood by the pantry door, her face still, eyes bright with anger she knew better than to show openly. As Naomi reached the service entrance, Mrs. Whitcomb handed her a final paycheck envelope and spoke loudly enough for others to hear. You are not to return to this property. If you attempt contact with the family, security will be notified. Naomi took the envelope. I understand. Mrs. Whitcomb leaned closer. Girls like you always think a rich man is a ladder. Naomi's eyes lifted to hers. Women like me build ladders for ourselves. Mrs. Whitcomb looked offended, but before she could answer, thunder rolled beyond the back door. Rain had begun again, steady and cold. Mr. Haynes opened the door. Naomi stepped out with her bag against her side, the unsigned agreement resting inside it like a false confession she refused to become. She walked down the service steps, across the wet gravel, and toward the bus stop nearly half a mile beyond the estate gate. No one offered a ride. No one offered an umbrella. Behind her, the mansion glowed with warm light, untouched by the storm it had created. At the edge of the driveway, Grace appeared briefly at a side door and slipped something into the pocket of Naomi's coat hanging from her arm. She did it so quickly that the security camera above the mudroom would only catch motion, not meaning. Naomi did not look until she reached the stone wall near the estate entrance. There, under the cover of rain and passing traffic, she opened the pocket and found 3 folded pages sealed in plastic, a copy of the termination notice, a photocopy of the staff log showing she had arrived on time, and a handwritten note from Grace that said, "Keep everything. I heard him." Naomi closed her hand around the pages and, for the first time that day, her breath broke. Not into collapse. Into recognition. She was not entirely alone. The bus arrived 12 minutes late, headlights blurred by rain. Naomi climbed aboard soaked through, paid her fare, and sat near the back with her bag on her lap and one hand over her stomach. 2 women glanced at her uniform and then looked away. A child across the aisle smiled at her, and Naomi tried to smile back. Her job was gone. Her reputation was already being poisoned inside a mansion she had cleaned with care. The man who should have taken responsibility had chosen lawyers, lies, and humiliation instead. But inside her bag were schoolbooks, dates, notes, an unsigned agreement, and Grace's copied pages. Inside her body was a child Richard Whitmore believed he could erase before the world ever learned his name. Naomi looked out at the wet Atlanta streets and made herself a promise so quiet no one on that bus could hear it. She would not let Richard turn her child into a secret of shame. She would not let his money define the truth. She would survive the whispers, the closed doors, the lost references, the looks from people who believed a powerful man before a working black woman. And she would keep everything. Every paper. Every date. Every name. Every insult. Every threat dressed as advice. Richard thought he had ended the matter by pushing her out through the service door in the rain. He thought humiliation would teach her to disappear. But all he had done was create witnesses, documents, and a son who would one day understand exactly why his mother had carried an old envelope through 25 years of silence. For 25 years, Naomi Carter built a life out of what Richard Whitmore believed he had destroyed. She did not become famous. She did not stand in front of cameras. She did not chase him through courtrooms or beg the city to believe her over a man whose name appeared on buildings. Instead, she did something quieter, harder, and more powerful. She survived with discipline. The first apartment she raised Malcolm in was a 1-bedroom unit on the west side of Atlanta, with thin walls, a window unit that rattled in July, and a kitchen table so small it could barely hold 2 plates and an open textbook at the same time. Naomi slept on the pull-out couch so her son could have the bedroom when he was old enough to need space. In the early years, she worked wherever she could without depending on a reference from the Whitmore household. Hotel housekeeping. Night cleaning at a medical office. Weekend shifts at a senior care facility. Later, after finishing school 1 class at a time, she became a licensed practical nurse, then kept studying until she could work full-time in a clinic. Nothing about it was easy, but Naomi never presented struggle to Malcolm as shame. She presented it as weather. Something you respected, prepared for, and walked through without letting it name you. When Malcolm was little, he knew his mother came home tired. He knew her hands smelled faintly of soap, antiseptic, and paper charts. He knew she checked the door lock twice before bed and kept a manila envelope in a plastic storage box under the closet floorboard. He did not know why she sometimes took that envelope out after midnight, reading old papers at the kitchen table while a cup of tea went cold beside her. He did not know why certain names made her face go still. He only knew that whenever he asked about his father, Naomi chose her words with the care of someone handling glass. He was not ready to be honest, she would say. Not he did not want you. Not you were abandoned because you were not enough. Never that. Naomi refused to let Richard's cowardice become Malcolm's mirror. She raised her son with rules that sounded simple but carried the weight of everything she had endured. Read before you sign. Keep copies. Be early. Look people in the eye, but do not waste your anger on people who want to use it against you. Speak clearly. Walk away when walking away protects your future. Stand still when standing still protects your name. Malcolm grew up hearing those lessons before he understood their origin. By age 7, he was putting his school papers in labeled folders because his mother said organized people were harder to dismiss. By age 10, he knew how to ask adults to explain things in writing. By age 12, he could tell when a person was being kind and when they were being nice because they wanted control. Naomi did not teach him suspicion. She taught him observation. There was a difference. Every report card went into a folder. Every scholarship application had a backup copy. Every letter from a landlord, school administrator, or employer was dated and filed. Their apartment did not have expensive furniture, but it had order. A calendar by the refrigerator. A jar for bus fare. A shelf for library books. A small framed photograph of Naomi's mother, Lillian, whose lessons lived on in every careful habit. Malcolm was a quiet child, not because he lacked feeling, but because he had been raised by a woman who understood that composure could be armor when the world expected black pain to perform itself loudly before being judged. Teachers noticed him early. He finished assignments before other students, not with showy confidence, but with steady focus. When classmates teased him for wearing thrift store blazers to debate club, he adjusted the sleeves and kept speaking. When a guidance counselor suggested he aim for something practical instead of law, Naomi requested the meeting notes in writing, then sat beside Malcolm that night and helped him search for pre-law summer programs. She did not insult the counselor. She did not storm into the school. She simply refused to let another adult shrink her son's future because it made their expectations more comfortable. Malcolm watched and learned. His mother's power was not loud, but it changed outcomes. In high school, he worked part-time at a grocery store, volunteered at a legal aid clinic filing papers, and spent Saturday mornings at the public library reading cases he barely understood at first. Something about the law fascinated him, the way a sentence could protect or trap, the way a signature could free someone or silence them, the way people with money used documents as weapons while people without money were often told documents did not matter until it was too late. Naomi never told him the full story, but she did not hide the shape of it either. When Malcolm was 16 and found her crying quietly over an old envelope, she wiped her face and said, "Some people count on the poor forgetting what happened because survival takes so much time. That is why you write things down." He sat across from her, old enough to hear the pain but not yet old enough to carry it. "Is this about him?" he asked. Naomi folded the paper slowly. "It is about truth." Malcolm did not ask more that night. He was learning that his mother's silence was not surrender. It was a locked room, and she would open it only when opening it would not break him. Years passed. Malcolm earned scholarships, graduated near the top of his class, and left Atlanta for college with 2 suitcases, a prepaid phone, and a letter from Naomi tucked inside his jacket pocket. She had written only 3 sentences on the last page: "Remember who you are before any room tells you who it thinks you should be. Do not confuse access with belonging. And if power ever speaks down to you, listen closely, because it usually reveals what it is afraid of losing." Malcolm read that letter before his first college interview, before his law school entrance exam, before the day he walked into a corporate law internship where almost no one looked like him. He did not become a lawyer to chase his father. For a long time, he did not even know enough to chase him. He became a lawyer because he had watched his mother spend her life navigating systems that were not designed to protect women like her, and he wanted to understand the language those systems respected. By 25, Malcolm Carter was not the angry secret Richard Whitmore might have imagined if he had ever allowed himself to think of the child at all. Malcolm was precise, controlled, and dangerous in the way truth becomes dangerous when it has been trained. He specialized in corporate governance, executive misconduct, and internal investigations. He learned how companies hid private shame inside public accounting. He learned how payments were disguised as consulting fees, how non-disclosure agreements were used to bury misconduct, how board members ignored warning signs until liability threatened the stock price. Every case sharpened him. Every deposition taught him patience. Every arrogant executive who thought charm could outrun documents reminded him of a man whose face he had never been shown in full. Naomi watched his rise with pride, but also with a heaviness she tried to hide. She kept a small scrapbook of his achievements beside the same plastic storage box that held the manila envelope. Newspaper clippings from his moot court win. A photograph of him in his law school graduation robe. His first business card from a respected firm in Atlanta. On the outside, it looked like a mother saving memories. Underneath, it was something else too. It was proof that Richard had failed to erase what he refused to acknowledge. Malcolm's life had become the answer to a question Richard never wanted asked. Then Naomi got sick. At first, she called it fatigue. Too many shifts. Not enough rest. Normal things working people say when their bodies ask for attention they cannot afford to give. Malcolm noticed the pauses in her voice over the phone, the way she sat down before answering the door, the pharmacy bags appearing more often on the kitchen counter. He moved back to Atlanta under the excuse of taking a position closer to clients, but Naomi knew better. She let him help because love, too, required humility. It was during those months, when the apartment had become quieter and the afternoon light fell across the floor in long gold lines, that Naomi began preparing him without saying everything. She asked him to bring down the plastic storage box. She had him sort old photographs, pay stubs, certificates, and medical records. She showed him how she had kept his childhood organized year by year. Birth certificate. Immunization records. School awards. Scholarship letters. Then, one evening, she stopped him before he put the lid back on the box. "There is another folder," she said. Malcolm looked at her, and something in her tone made him still. Naomi pointed toward the closet floorboard. His hands were steady when he lifted it, but his chest tightened before he even saw the envelope. It was old, sealed inside a plastic sleeve, thick with time. On the front, in Naomi's handwriting, were 2 words, "For Malcolm." She did not let him open it yet. Not that night. She placed her hand over his and held it there, her fingers thinner than they had been when he was a boy, but still warm, still firm. "I did not keep this because I wanted you to hate anyone," she said. "I kept it because one day you might need to know that your life began with truth, even if someone powerful tried to call it something else." Malcolm looked at the envelope, then back at his mother. He saw fear in her eyes, but not the kind that runs. The kind that has carried something heavy for so long it does not know how to set it down without shaking. "Is this about my father?" he asked. Naomi breathed in slowly. "Yes." The room became very still. Outside, traffic passed on the avenue. A neighbor's television murmured through the wall. Somewhere downstairs, a child laughed. Malcolm did not reach for the envelope. He did not demand answers. He had been raised better than to mistake pain for a door he could kick open. He simply nodded and said, "Then we will open it when you are ready." Naomi's eyes filled, but her voice stayed calm. "No, baby," she said. "We will open it when you are ready." That was the first true glimpse of what Richard Whitmore had never understood. Naomi had not spent 25 years hiding weakness. She had spent 25 years raising strength carefully enough that when the truth finally entered Malcolm's hands, it would not turn him reckless. It would turn him exact. Naomi waited until the next Sunday afternoon to open the envelope with Malcolm, because Sunday had always been the day she taught him hard things gently. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after church clothes have been hung away, dishes have been washed, and the city outside has softened into distant traffic and wind against old windows. Malcolm sat across from her at the small kitchen table where he had done homework as a boy, the same table where she had filled out nursing school applications after midnight and sorted bills by due date with a pencil behind her ear. Naomi placed the plastic-sleeved envelope between them, but she did not push it toward him. Not yet. Her hand rested on top of it, thin now, the veins more visible, the wedding ring she had never worn. Replaced by a plain silver band she bought for herself years ago because she wanted her hand to carry something chosen. Before you read this, she said, I need you to understand something. Evidence does not heal everything. It only makes it harder for powerful people to lie without consequence. Malcolm looked at the envelope, then at his mother. He was 25, already a lawyer, already trained to read silence in conference rooms and hesitation in sworn statements, but in that moment he was also her son, sitting in the apartment where she had turned exhaustion into dinner and fear into rules he could live by. I understand, he said. Naomi studied his face, searching for the boy who once asked why other children had fathers at school events, and the man who now knew that some absences were not accidents. Then she slid the envelope across the table. Malcolm opened it slowly. The first page was the termination notice from the Whitmore household, dated the morning after Naomi had told Richard the truth. The second was the unsigned separation agreement Elaine Porter had tried to force into her hands. The third was Grace Miller's copied staff log, showing Naomi had arrived on time and had not been under disciplinary review before that day. Beneath those were Richard's handwritten notes, folded carefully and preserved in plastic sleeves, requests for Naomi to come to the study after hours, schedule changes written in his own hand, one note with his initials beside a private instruction no head housekeeper had authorized. Malcolm did not speak as he read. His face became still in a way Naomi recognized because she had built that stillness inside him one lesson at a time. He was angry. She could feel it across the table. But his anger did not control his hands. He turned each page by the corner, careful not to damage anything. Then came the medical clinic confirmation, the date of her appointment, the early prenatal record, and a copy of Malcolm's birth certificate listing only Naomi Carter as parent. Malcolm's jaw tightened. Naomi looked down because that page had always hurt differently. It was not just an omission. It was the shape of a man's refusal made official. There is more, she said. Malcolm lifted the next sleeve. Inside was a check copy from a private account tied to a Whitmore Household Services entity, not made out to Naomi, but to a small law office that had closed years earlier. Stapled behind it was a memo line that read, Personal Matter Containment. Malcolm read it twice. Something changed in his eyes. Not surprise. Recognition. The language was corporate enough to hide in accounting, but personal enough to stink of concealment. Who gave you this? He asked. Grace Miller, Naomi said. She worked in the kitchen. She made copies when she could. She told me to keep everything. Malcolm turned another page and found Grace's handwritten note from the day Naomi was forced out into the rain. Keep everything. I heard him. His fingers paused on the sentence. Is she still alive? Yes, Naomi said. Retired. Lives outside Decatur with her sister. We spoke once every Christmas until my health got worse. Malcolm took out his phone and created a note, but he did not call yet. He wrote Grace Miller, Decatur, kitchen witness, termination day. Naomi watched him make the list, and for the first time, the weight she had carried did not feel lighter, but it felt shared. The folder also held pages from a small notebook Naomi had kept during those months, dates, shifts, schedule changes, who was present in the house, when Richard called her into the study, when Mrs. Whitcomb changed instructions after speaking with him, when Elaine Porter arrived unexpectedly. Naomi had not written like a person trying to dramatize pain. She had written like someone preserving facts before the world could rearrange them. Malcolm recognized that immediately. Courts liked facts. Boards liked dates. Investigators liked patterns. Richard Whitmore had counted on shame to scatter memory, but Naomi had met shame with organization. At the very bottom of the envelope was the document she had avoided looking at for years, a private genetic test she had ordered when Malcolm was 19, using medical samples and a legal process that had cost more than she could easily afford. It was not enough by itself to force a public conclusion without challenge, but it was enough to begin. Enough to request more. Enough to prove Naomi had not invented the truth she had lived under. Malcolm read the probability line, and the apartment seemed to shrink around him. For a long moment, he did not move. Then he placed the paper gently on the table and closed his eyes. Naomi reached across and touched his wrist. "I am sorry I waited." Malcolm opened his eyes, and there was pain in them, but not accusation. "You were protecting me." "I was trying to." "You did." The words nearly broke her, but she held herself together because he was doing the same. Malcolm gathered the documents into careful stacks: employment records, personal notes, witness evidence, financial trace, identity records. His training had taken over, but not in a cold way. It was the way a man holds a fire without letting it burn the house down. "This is not just about what he did to you," he said quietly. "If any of this money moved through a company-controlled account, if legal services were billed through Whitmore Holdings, if executives knew and concealed it, then this becomes a governance issue." Naomi did not pretend to understand every legal pathway, but she understood the shift in his voice. The truth was no longer trapped inside her apartment. It had found a door. Over the next 2 weeks, Malcolm began working at night after his regular cases, not as a son chasing revenge, but as an attorney building a record strong enough to survive rich men, expensive lawyers, and selective memory. He scanned every document. He created encrypted backups. He ordered certified copies where possible. He searched public corporate records and old property filings. He traced the law office from the check copy and found its archived registration. He found that Elaine Porter had joined Whitmore Holdings as outside counsel only months before Naomi was terminated, and that her firm had billed the company for executive risk consultation during the same quarter. He found no smoking gun yet, but he found smoke in too many rooms. Then he located David Lang. The former chief financial officer had left Whitmore Holdings years earlier after what the press called a strategic disagreement. He now lived in Savannah, serving on non-profit boards and avoiding interviews. Malcolm sent him a formal letter, respectful and precise, asking about historical payments categorized as household-adjacent executive matters. David did not answer for 4 days. On the 5th, Malcolm received a call from a blocked number. The voice on the other end sounded older, careful, and tired. "Are you Naomi Carter's son?" Malcolm looked across his office at the scanned folder on his screen. "Yes." There was a silence. "I wondered when this would surface." Malcolm did not push. He had learned that witnesses who carried guilt often needed space to step toward it. "Then you know something." David exhaled. "I know I saw things I should have questioned harder." Malcolm scheduled a meeting in a quiet coffee shop near Savannah 2 days later. David arrived wearing a blue blazer, no tie, carrying a leather portfolio that looked too old for show. He did not offer excuses first. That made Malcolm listen. David explained that, 25 years earlier, Richard had instructed legal and finance staff to process several private legal expenses through ambiguous executive accounts during a sensitive acquisition period. David had seen a memo referencing a household employee, reputational exposure, and containment strategy. He had questioned Elaine Porter once. She told him it was a personal matter approved at the highest level and not material to operations. David accepted that answer because accepting it protected his career. He had regretted it for years. "Do you have anything?" Malcolm asked. David opened the portfolio and removed 2 photocopied pages, not originals, but internal routing sheets with initials, dates, billing categories, and Elaine Porter's authorization code. "I kept them because I told myself good people keep proof even when they fail to act," David said. That sentence never made me feel better. Malcolm accepted the pages without triumph. "It should not." David nodded. "I know. Every word they said was being recorded, not secretly in a dangerous way, but with David's written consent placed on the table between them." Malcolm had brought a simple agreement, explaining that David's statement could be used in shareholder review, legal proceedings, or board investigation. David signed it after reading every line. Naomi had taught Malcolm well. No shortcuts. No emotional ambush. Make the record clean enough that the truth cannot be dismissed as revenge. Grace Miller was next. She agreed to meet Malcolm at her sister's house in Decatur, where the living room smelled of lemon furniture polish and peppermint tea. Grace was older now, her hands stiff from arthritis, her hair silver, her eyes just as sharp as Naomi had described. When Malcolm introduced himself, Grace covered her mouth for a moment and whispered, "You have her eyes." He had prepared questions, but that sentence nearly pulled him out of his discipline. He sat across from her with his notebook open and asked permission to record. Grace gave it. Then she told him what she had heard in the breakfast room, what Mrs. Whitcomb had said, how Elaine Porter pushed the agreement, how Richard threatened Naomi's future without using words obvious enough for easy punishment. Grace admitted she had been afraid. She had a son in trade school then, bills of her own, no savings large enough to survive being blacklisted by a family like the Whitmores. But she had made copies because she could not bear the thought of Naomi leaving with nothing but shame they had created for her. "Your mother did not beg," Grace said. "I want that in the record." She stood there like a queen in a Maid uniform. Malcolm lowered his pen for a second. "It is in the record," he said. After Grace signed her statement, she gave him one final item, a photograph taken at a staff holiday gathering, with Naomi in the background near the service hall and Richard turned toward her in a way that made Grace uncomfortable even now. The photo proved nothing alone. But evidence rarely wins alone. It wins by becoming part of a pattern. By then, Malcolm had also learned that Whitmore Holdings was preparing for a massive acquisition vote, one that required board approval and clean executive disclosures. Even more importantly, a shareholder fund he sometimes represented, Northbridge Stewardship Group, had recently increased its position and was pressing for a governance audit. The timing was not luck. It was leverage. Malcolm disclosed his personal connection to the fund's ethics committee before proceeding. He did not hide it. He did not want Richard's lawyers later claiming conflict of interest had poisoned the process. Northbridge reviewed the preliminary documents and authorized Malcolm to investigate potential executive misconduct and undisclosed misuse of corporate resources. That authorization changed everything. Malcolm was no longer only a son holding his mother's pain. He was a legal representative with a duty to shareholders and a pathway into the boardroom Richard valued more than confession. Naomi listened when Malcolm explained it to her from the chair beside her bed. Her body was weaker now, but her mind followed every word. "So you can make them look at it?" she asked. "Yes," Malcolm said. "Not as gossip. Not as family drama. As evidence." Naomi looked toward the window, where evening light touched the old curtains. "That room was never meant for women like me." Malcolm folded his hands together, fighting the emotion rising in his throat. Then they should have thought of that before building it on lies. She turned back to him, and for the first time in weeks, a small smile reached her eyes. "Do not let anger lead you." "I will not. Let truth lead." "I will." Naomi nodded, satisfied not because the pain was gone, but because it finally had direction. Richard Whitmore, still high above Atlanta in offices of glass and steel, had no idea that the past he buried was being sorted into exhibits, witness statements, financial records, phone logs, and board-ready evidence. He did not know Grace Miller had kept her memory sharp. He did not know David Lang had kept copies. He did not know Naomi's old folder had become a legal file. He did not know Malcolm Carter was not coming to scream in a lobby, threaten a lawsuit in anger, or beg for recognition. Malcolm was building something far more dangerous to a man like Richard. He was building a record. And records, once complete, do not tremble. Richard Whitmore did not know Malcolm Carter was Naomi's son when the first warning reached his office. That ignorance made him careless. It arrived on a Monday morning in a confidential memorandum from Northbridge Stewardship Group, requesting clarification on historical executive legal expenses, household-adjacent settlements, and disclosure procedures connected to the acquisition vote scheduled for Friday. The language was professional, dry, and controlled, but Richard had spent enough years reading legal threats disguised as polite inquiries to recognize danger beneath clean formatting. He stood in his corner office above Atlanta, the city shining below him, the memorandum open on his desk, while Elaine Porter sat across from him with her tablet balanced on one knee. Richard read the first page twice, then the name at the bottom. Malcolm Carter, legal representative. The name meant nothing to him. Carter was common. Malcolm was just another young attorney with good stationery and an inflated sense of purpose. Richard placed the memorandum down and gave a short, humorless laugh. Northbridge is trying to delay the vote. Elaine's face remained careful. Age had made her more polished, not softer. Possibly. But the categories they are asking about are specific. Then someone fed them language. Maybe. Richard turned toward the window. Who? Elaine hesitated. It could be old finance staff. It could be a disgruntled employee. It could be nothing more than a fishing expedition. Richard turned back. Do not tell me what it could be. Tell me whether it creates exposure. Elaine looked at the memorandum again. If they have documents tied to company-paid legal services for private matters, yes. If they have witness statements, more so. If they connect any concealment to the current acquisition disclosures, the board will have to review it before the vote. Richard's eyes cooled. The acquisition was not just another deal. It was the final monument he intended to build before stepping aside on his own terms, a merger that would make Whitmore Holdings impossible to discuss without discussing him. He had already prepared speeches about legacy and continuity. He had already chosen the magazine profile. He had already imagined the standing ovation from directors who owed their seats to his success. No unknown attorney was going to drag a 25-year-old household inconvenience into the room where his empire was being crowned. Find out who Malcolm Carter is, he said. I already started. Elaine tapped her tablet. Corporate attorney. Governance and executive misconduct. Educated, disciplined, very careful. He represents Northbridge on several matters. No obvious scandal, no obvious weakness. Richard disliked that answer. He preferred opponents with habits he could exploit. Everyone has a weakness. I am looking. Look faster. By noon, the search had moved from legal review to personal attack. Richard called a meeting in his private conference room with Elaine, the current communications director, and a security consultant who specialized in reputational risk while never calling it intimidation. No one said the word smear at first. They used softer words, because soft language had always helped Richard feel civilized while choosing cruel things. Background assessment. Narrative preparation. Credibility review. Potential conflicts. Malcolm's education, clients, speeches, articles, and professional relationships appeared on the screen. Richard stood at the head of the table, arms folded, studying the young man's photograph from a law firm website. Malcolm wore a dark suit and a controlled expression, eyes direct, jaw calm. Something about that calm bothered Richard, though he could not name why. He is young, Richard said. Young attorneys like attention. The communications director nodded quickly. We can frame this as activist overreach. A shareholder fund using an ambitious attorney to manufacture controversy before a vote. Elaine did not object, but she did not smile. Careful. If we attack too directly and he has evidence, it looks retaliatory. Richard's mouth tightened. Then we do not attack directly. We raise questions. The security consultant asked, questions about motive? Motive, competence, conflict of interest. Find any personal connection to former staff, any financial incentive, anything that suggests he is not neutral. Elaine scrolled through her notes. He disclosed a personal connection to the ethics committee, but the file is privileged at Northbridge. We do not know what it is. Richard's eyes narrowed. Personal connection to what? The historical matter, presumably. Presumably is not enough. He leaned over the table. Call Grace Miller. The name changed the air in the room. Elaine looked up slowly. Grace Miller. Kitchen staff. Years ago. She may have made copies of things she should not have had. Richard, Elaine said carefully, contacting an old witness before a board review could be interpreted badly. Not if we are checking facts. It depends how the call goes. Richard's smile was thin. Then make sure it goes well. But Richard did not let Elaine make the call. That was his arrogance working faster than his caution. He waited until evening, after the office had emptied and the city lights reflected in the glass walls around him. Then he used a private number and called Grace Miller himself. Grace was 72 now, living in a small Decatur house with blue shutters and potted ferns on the porch. She was watching the local news with her sister when the phone rang. She almost did not answer. When she heard Richard Whitmore's voice, her back straightened as if 25 years had folded in half. Richard opened with charm. Grace, it has been a long time. Grace looked toward the small digital recorder sitting beside her lamp, the one Malcolm had given her after she signed her witness statement, and said, if anyone contacts you, do not argue. Just preserve the call. She pressed record before answering. Mr. Whitmore. I hope you are well. Well enough. Good. I am glad to hear that. I understand you may have been contacted recently by someone asking questions about old household matters. Grace's eyes moved to her sister, who muted the television. I have been asked to tell the truth. Richard chuckled softly, as if speaking to a confused employee from another century. Truth can become complicated after so many years. Memory changes. People influence each other. Documents appear without context. Grace did not take the bait. Some things are not hard to remember. No, Richard said. Voice cooling a degree. But memory can be expensive when it gets pulled into legal proceedings. Depositions. Subpoenas. Travel. Stress. At your age, I would hate to see you dragged into something unnecessary. Grace looked at the recorder's red light. Every word he said was being recorded. Are you warning me? I am trying to spare you. That sounds familiar. A pause. Richard did not like the answer. Grace, let me be direct. Whatever you think you heard 25 years ago, you were kitchen staff. You were not in legal meetings. You were not privy to executive decisions. A good attorney will make that very clear. I heard what was said in that breakfast room. You heard emotion. I heard a threat. His voice hardened. Be careful. Grace's hand trembled, but her voice did not. I am being careful. That is why I am not having this conversation alone. Richard went silent. What does that mean? Grace ended the call. She sent the recording to Malcolm before Richard had even lowered the phone from his ear. In his office across town, Malcolm listened once, then saved 3 encrypted copies. He did not smile. This was not victory yet. It was Richard doing exactly what Naomi had said powerful men did when truth approached, trying to make the witness smaller. Malcolm called Grace and asked if she was safe. She said yes. He asked if she wanted counsel present going forward. She said, "I thought that was you." He answered, "Then from now on, no one speaks to you without me." The next morning, Richard escalated again. Elaine arrived at his office to find him dictating instructions to an assistant. Pull all archived household legal files from the off-site storage vendor. Anything older than 20 years with personal settlement tags goes to Elaine's team first. Nothing leaves this company without review. Elaine closed the door behind her. Stop. Richard looked annoyed. Excuse me. If Northbridge has already asked for those categories, moving files now looks terrible. We are reviewing our own records. Then document the review properly. I do not need a lecture. You need restraint. Richard's expression darkened. What I need is for people I pay to protect me to stop sounding frightened. Elaine had protected him for decades, but she was not sentimental. Her loyalty had always depended on the belief that Richard knew how to stay above the line where misconduct became evidence. Now he was approaching that line with both hands out. Do not contact any more former employees, she said. Do not send informal instructions about old files. Do not say anything in writing you do not want read aloud in a boardroom. Richard laughed once. This boardroom belongs to me. Elaine stared at him. That is exactly the kind of sentence that gets men removed from them. He dismissed her with a wave, but he did not listen. By afternoon, an internal email went out from Richard's personal executive assistant to archives management, copying 2 loyal senior staffers. At Mr. Whitmore's direction, all historical executive household and personal matter files are to be isolated immediately and reviewed for disposal eligibility before Friday's board vote. The wording was not as clean as Elaine would have made it. It was rushed. It was arrogant. It was exactly the kind of document Malcolm had been waiting for. One of the staffers copied on the email was not loyal to Richard. She was loyal to policy, and she forwarded it anonymously to Northbridge's secure ethics portal within 30 minutes. Malcolm received it just after leaving Naomi's apartment. He had spent the afternoon beside her bed, reading aloud from a book she liked because her eyes tired easily now. She had listened with a faint smile until sleep took her. When his phone vibrated in the hallway, he stepped outside, opened the secure alert, and read the archive disposal email under the dim apartment corridor light. His face did not move, but his hand tightened around the phone. There it was. Not 25-year-old pain. Not memory. Not a witness recalling an old room. Current conduct. Current concealment. A current instruction tied directly to the pending board vote. Richard had taken the old wrong and refreshed it in writing. Malcolm looked back through the cracked apartment door at his mother sleeping beneath a thin blanket, her breathing soft but uneven. He thought of her stepping out into the rain with a canvas bag. He thought of Grace being told she was only kitchen staff. He thought of Richard high above Atlanta, still convinced that files, women, workers, and sons could be managed if they threatened his comfort. Then Malcolm called Northbridge's ethics chair and said, "We need to move the meeting up." But Richard was not finished. On Wednesday, his communications team quietly floated a rumor to 2 business reporters that Northbridge was preparing a politically motivated attack on Whitmore Holdings using an attorney with a personal vendetta. No names were printed yet, but the language was meant to prepare the market to distrust Malcolm before he ever entered the boardroom. By Wednesday night, a short item appeared in an online business newsletter. Sources close to Whitmore Holdings question whether outside governance pressure is being driven by undisclosed personal motives. Richard read it in his car and felt control returning. He mistook a planted shadow for protection. Malcolm read the same item at Naomi's kitchen table. Naomi was awake, wrapped in a robe, a cup of tea cooling between her hands. "Is that him?" she asked. Malcolm set the phone down. "Yes. He is trying to make you look angry." I know. Are you? Malcolm looked at her. Yes. Naomi nodded. Good. Just do not let him use it. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. He cannot. She studied his face for a long moment, then said, You sound sure. I am sure because he is still doing the same thing. He has had 25 years to become a better man, and he is choosing the same lie with better technology. Naomi closed her eyes briefly. I did not want this to become your burden. It became my inheritance when he tried to erase you. She opened her eyes, and there was pain there, but pride too. Then carry it clean. I will. The final line was crossed Thursday morning. Richard, angry that Grace had stopped answering calls and that Northbridge had demanded emergency board time before the acquisition vote, ordered a private investigator to approach Grace's neighborhood and verify her living situation. The investigator never entered her house, never touched anyone, never broke the law in any obvious dramatic way. That was not Richard's style. Instead, he sat in a car near the curb, photographed the exterior, asked a neighbor whether Grace lived alone, and left a business card tucked into her mailbox with no message written on it. It was meant to unsettle her. It was meant to remind an old woman that powerful people could still find her address. Grace called Malcolm immediately. For the first time since they had met, her voice shook. He sent someone to my house. Malcolm was already standing before she finished the sentence. Lock your door. I am calling local council and Northbridge security. Do not speak to anyone else. I am not scared for me, Grace said, though she was. I am scared because this is what he does. He makes people feel surrounded. Malcolm's voice became very quiet. Not anymore. He filed a formal witness intimidation concern with Northbridge's outside counsel, preserved the neighborhood camera footage from Grace's sister's porch, obtained the investigator's license plate from a neighbor's doorbell camera, and documented the business card in a time-stamped evidence log. None of it was explosive alone. Together, it formed the pattern Richard had spent decades denying: pressure the worker, isolate the witness, question the motive, move the files, attack the messenger, protect the throne. That evening, Malcolm sent one final letter to Elaine Porter and the board's independent directors. The letter was brief, professional, and devastating. It referenced the original document request, the witness statement, the recorded contact with Grace Miller, the archive disposal email, the planted media narrative, and the private investigator's visit. It warned that proceeding with the acquisition vote without addressing potential executive misconduct and witness pressure could expose the board to serious governance liability. It requested speaking time at the emergency board session the next morning. Richard received a copy at 10:11 that night. He was alone in his study at the mansion, older now, heavier in the face, the walls around him decorated with awards that suddenly looked less like achievements and more like witnesses. He read the letter once, then again, then slammed it onto the desk without thinking. A glass of water tipped and spread across the polished wood, soaking the corner of a magazine profile draft titled The Legacy Builder. For several seconds, Richard stared at the water moving toward his own printed photograph. Then he called Elaine. She answered on the fourth ring. Do not tell me to calm down, he said. Elaine's voice was flat. Then do not call me asking for advice you refuse to take. I want this Malcolm Carter kept out of my boardroom. The independent directors have already approved his appearance. On whose authority? On theirs. That is what independent means. Richard's breathing changed. He is trying to destroy me. He is trying to be heard. He is nobody. Elaine paused. You should be very careful with that assumption. But Richard had survived too long on assumptions to recognize the cliff beneath this one. Tomorrow, he said, I will remind that board who built this company. And if Mr. Carter thinks some kitchen maid's memory and a pile of old papers can undo me, he is about to learn how the real world works. Elaine did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice sounded almost tired. Richard, What was Naomi Carter to you? The question struck the room harder than any accusation. For a moment, there was only the sound of the water dripping from the desk edge onto the floor. A mistake, Richard said finally. Elaine closed her eyes on the other end of the call. It was the worst possible answer, not because it was surprising, but because it revealed what had always been true. Even after 25 years, even after a child, even after illness, witnesses, documents, and danger to his own company, Richard did not see Naomi as a woman he had wronged. He saw her as an error in his story. That was why there could be no mercy left in the narrative. Not cruelty. Not revenge for its own sake. But consequence. The kind that arrives when a man has been warned by truth, by witnesses, by time, by age, by every chance to confess, and still chooses to protect his pride over the people he harmed. The next morning, Malcolm Carter dressed in a dark suit in the same small apartment where his mother had raised him. Naomi was too weak to come, but she insisted on sitting up as he adjusted his tie. On the kitchen table lay the black folder, organized in sections, every page labeled, every statement signed, every recording transcribed, every new act of pressure placed behind the old evidence like a bridge from past to present. Naomi reached for his hand. "Do not go in there to make him love you," she said. Malcolm leaned down and kissed her forehead. "I am not. Do not go in there to make him ashamed. Shame is between him and God. I know." Her fingers tightened around his. "Go in there so they cannot say they did not know." Malcolm picked up the folder. His calm was not forgiveness. His silence was not weakness. It was control sharpened by every insult his mother had survived and every document Richard had created while trying to bury her. When Malcolm stepped out of the apartment and into the morning light, Richard Whitmore was already on his way to the boardroom, still believing he could control the room because he had controlled so many before it. He did not know that his final mistake had already been made. He had tried to frighten an old witness, move old files, poison a young attorney's name, and reduce Naomi Carter's life to a mistake. After that, there was nothing left to misunderstand. The boardroom was arranged to make Richard Whitmore look inevitable. His chair sat at the head of the long glass table, backed by the Atlanta skyline and 42 floors of distance from the streets where people like Naomi Carter once caught buses in the rain. The directors were already seated when Malcolm Carter entered, each of them surrounded by tablets, leather folders, bottled water, and the careful silence of people who understood that something was wrong but did not yet know how expensive the truth might become. Richard stood when Malcolm came in, not out of respect, but to reclaim the room before the younger man could speak. He wore a charcoal suit, a pale blue tie, and the confident expression of a man who believed authority was a kind of weather everyone else had. To dress for. Elaine Porter sat to his right, her face composed, though her eyes remained fixed on the black folder in Malcolm's hand. She knew enough now to be afraid of paper. Malcolm walked to the far end of the table alone. No assistant followed him. No security guard announced him. He placed the folder down, set a small recorder beside it for the official minutes with the board secretary's permission, and looked directly at the independent directors before he looked at Richard. That choice mattered. He had not come to argue with the man who abandoned his mother. He had come to make the people protecting that man hear the record. Richard smiled thinly. "Mr. Carter, I understand Northbridge has concerns, but this company will not allow a last-minute activist performance to derail a lawful vote." Malcolm did not answer the insult. He opened the folder. Northbridge requested emergency board time because the pending acquisition depends on clean executive disclosures, accurate historical risk reporting, and the absence of ongoing concealment. The documents I am about to present concern all three. A director named Helen Brooks leaned forward. "Proceed." Richard's smile stiffened. Malcolm began with numbers, not blood. He displayed the first exhibit on the boardroom screen, archived billing records from 25 years earlier, routed through an executive risk account during a major acquisition quarter. The language was dry. Private matter containment. Household adjacent legal consultation. Reputational exposure review. Richard exhaled through his nose as if bored. Old administrative classifications. Nothing more. Malcolm placed a second document beside the first. These routing sheets carry authorization codes connected to counsel retained by this company, not by your household personally. Elaine's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. David Lang's signed statement appeared next, not as a dramatic confession, but as a clean excerpt confirming that he had questioned the payments and was told they were approved at the highest level. The room shifted. Not loudly. Just enough that leather chairs creaked and one director stopped tapping his pen. Richard turned toward the board. David Lang left this company under strained circumstances. I would caution everyone against treating old resentment as evidence. Malcolm clicked once. Grace Miller's signed witness statement appeared on the screen. Richard's face did not change yet, but his eyes sharpened. Former kitchen staff, he said, allowing a trace of contempt to slip into the words. This is what Northbridge is relying on. Malcolm looked at him calmly. Former kitchen staff who witnessed a household employee being pressured to sign a separation agreement after disclosing a pregnancy. The boardroom went quieter. Richard's hand moved toward his water glass, then stopped. Elaine looked down. Malcolm did not rush. He let Naomi's name wait one more second, because for 25 years Richard had counted on people moving past her too quickly. Then Malcolm placed the termination notice on the screen. At the top was the date. Under employee name were two words that had survived every attempt to bury them, Naomi Carter. Richard's face lost the first shade of color. Not enough for the room to call it fear, but enough for Elaine to see the past arrive. Helen Brooks read the name aloud softly. Naomi Carter. Malcolm turned one page in the folder. 25 years ago, Naomi Carter worked in Richard Whitmore's private residence while he served as chief executive officer of this company. The day after she informed him she was pregnant, her employment was terminated, she was offered money through legal channels connected to company-paid counsel, and she was presented with a non-disclosure agreement she refused to sign. Richard stood straighter. This is outrageous. Malcolm placed the unsigned agreement on the screen. This is the agreement. Richard pointed toward him. You are using a dead woman's old grievance to damage a public company. The sentence landed badly. Several directors looked up at once. Malcolm's eyes did not move from Richard's face. She is not a grievance. Richard's mouth tightened. You know what I mean. Yes, Malcolm said. That is the problem. He clicked again. The screen changed to a transcript from Grace Miller's recent recorded call. The room heard Richard's own words read aloud by the board secretary, because Malcolm had requested the transcript be entered into the minutes rather than played for drama. At your age, I would hate to see you dragged into something unnecessary. You were kitchen staff. You were not privy to executive decisions. A good attorney will make that very clear. Richard reached for interruption, but Helen Brooks raised a hand. Let him finish. That was the first visible transfer of power. Not from Richard to Malcolm, but from Richard back to the rules he had spent years bending. Malcolm placed the archive disposal email next, the one ordering historical executive household and personal matter files to be reviewed for disposal eligibility before the board vote. A low murmur moved around the table. Richard turned to Elaine. That email has been mischaracterized. Elaine did not defend him. Her silence entered the room like a door closing. Malcolm continued. The concern is not only what happened 25 years ago. The concern is that when asked about it now, Mr. Whitmore contacted a witness, authorized file movement, allowed a narrative questioning my motives, and permitted private pressure near that witness's home. Those actions occurred this week. A director at the far end removed his glasses. Mr. Whitmore, is any of this disputed? Richard gave a laugh that sounded too sharp to be confidence. Of course it is disputed. This young man has built a story out of household gossip, stale paperwork, and personal ambition. Malcolm closed the folder halfway, then stopped. This was the moment Richard had created for himself. He could have stayed quiet. He could have let counsel speak. He could have allowed the board to review documents without revealing the contempt still alive beneath his suit. Instead, he looked at Malcolm and said, "Who are you to walk into my boardroom and lecture me about my life?" Malcolm's calm did not break. He opened the final section of the folder. "I was waiting for that question." The room stilled. Malcolm took out 3 documents and placed them on the table one by one. The first was Naomi's prenatal medical record. The second was his birth certificate. The third was the legally obtained genetic test, followed by a pending petition for confirmatory testing using court-admissible procedures if Richard chose to contest it. He did not throw them down. He did not raise his voice. He gave the truth the dignity Richard had denied it. "My name is Malcolm Carter," he said. "Naomi Carter was my mother." Richard stared at the documents. For the first time all morning, he looked his age. His eyes moved from the birth certificate to Malcolm's face, searching now not for weakness, but for resemblance. The shape of the eyes. The line of the jaw. The composure that suddenly seemed less like a stranger's professionalism and more like 25 years of consequence standing in a tailored suit. "No," Richard said, but it came out thin. Malcolm did not flinch. "You do not have to like the truth for it to enter the record." Helen Brooks looked at Richard. "Is there a possibility that this man is your son?" Richard's lips parted. No answer came quickly enough. That delay did what Malcolm's anger never could have done. It told the board the denial was not clean. Malcolm looked around the table, making sure every director understood that the reveal was not a plea. "I did not come here to ask Richard Whitmore to be my father. I came here to show this board what kind of man led this company, what he used company resources to conceal, and what he was willing to do this week when a black woman's name returned to the room he thought she could never reach." Richard's hand tightened on the back of his chair. "This is a personal attack." Malcolm's voice remained even. "No. A personal attack is what happened when my mother was called a liar, stripped of work, threatened with ruined prospects, and pushed into silence while carrying a child you refused to acknowledge. This is a governance review." The distinction struck harder than shouting would have. Richard had prepared for emotion. He had prepared for accusation. He had not prepared for his own son to stand before his board and turn abandonment into evidence, humiliation into documentation, and a buried name into corporate liability. Elaine finally spoke, her voice low. "The independent directors should recess the acquisition vote pending review." Richard turned on her. "Elaine." She did not look at him. "Pending review," she repeated. The board secretary typed the words into the minutes. Malcolm gathered nothing from the table. He left every copy where the directors could see it. Naomi's name remained on the screen behind him, large, plain, impossible to walk around. Richard looked from the screen to Malcolm again, and the last of his command slipped. The boardroom he believed belonged to him had become the one place where he could no longer control the story. Every wall of glass reflected the same truth back at him. The woman he called a mistake had raised the man now holding him accountable, and every document he thought would disappear had arrived before the vote. The first consequence was silence. Not the frightened silence Richard Whitmore had spent his life imposing on employees, assistants, lawyers, and workers who depended on his approval, but a colder silence that formed when powerful people realized the danger was no longer outside the room. It was sitting at the head of their own table. For several seconds after Elaine Porter recommended pausing the acquisition vote, no one moved. The skyline behind Richard still glittered, the bottled water still stood untouched beside leather folders, the board secretary's fingers still hovered above the keyboard, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Richard had entered the room as the man everyone waited for. Now he stood as the risk everyone had to manage. Helen Brooks, chair of the independent directors, closed the folder in front of her and looked first at Malcolm, then at Elaine, then at the remaining members of the board. This meeting is entering executive session without Mr. Whitmore's participation, she said. Richard turned sharply. You cannot be serious. Helen did not raise her voice. I am. I founded the modern version of this company. And right now, the company requires independence from you. The sentence landed harder than anger because it carried procedure. Richard could argue with emotion. He could dismiss outrage. He could not easily dismiss a board chair speaking for fiduciary duty while the minutes were being recorded. Elaine shifted in her chair but did not come to his defense. That betrayal stunned him more than Malcolm's documents. Richard looked toward the general counsel as if decades of protected secrets should have earned him one more rescue. Elaine's face gave him nothing. Pending review, she said again, you should leave the room. Richard laughed once, but the sound collapsed in the middle. This is absurd. You are letting a personal vendetta hijack a multi-billion-dollar transaction. Malcolm stood at the far end of the table, hands resting lightly near Naomi's file, not triumphant, not smiling. The transaction was already compromised when undisclosed executive conduct became a governance issue and current witnesses were pressured. Richard pointed at him. You want money. The accusation came quickly, desperately, as if Richard needed the room to see Malcolm as greedy before it saw him as credible. Malcolm's expression did not change. No, then what do you want? Malcolm looked at the screen where Naomi Carter's name remained visible in clean black letters. I want the record corrected. That answer did what no shout could have done. It made Richard look small. Helen spoke again. Mr. Whitmore, you are hereby placed on administrative leave from all executive functions pending an independent investigation. You will not participate in acquisition negotiations. You will not contact former or current witnesses. You will not authorize document movement, destruction, reclassification, or external communications related to this matter. All company devices in your possession are subject to preservation hold effective immediately. Richard stared at her. You are removing me. Temporarily, pending investigation. On the word of him. Helen looked at the documents spread before her. On the basis of records, witness statements, financial routing sheets, recent correspondence, and your own conduct this week. A second director, Thomas Avery, who had spent years praising Richard at shareholder meetings, cleared his throat and added, the acquisition vote cannot proceed under these circumstances. Richard turned toward him with open disbelief. Tom. Avery avoided his eyes. The risk is too high. That was the moment Richard understood that loyalty built on profit ends when profit feels threatened. The directors who had clapped for his speeches, toasted his deals, and quoted his vision in interviews were no longer protecting him as a man. They were protecting themselves from being dragged down with him. Helen instructed the board secretary to record a formal resolution appointing an outside law firm and a forensic accounting team to investigate historical misuse of company resources, non-disclosure practices, witness contact, document preservation failures, and any executive misconduct related to Naomi Carter's employment and termination. She also ordered that Grace Miller and David Lang be treated as protected witnesses and that all further communication with them go only through independent counsel. Every instruction was specific. Every instruction took something from Richard that he had always assumed belonged to him: access, narrative, files, witnesses, timing, room control. When corporate security arrived, they did not grab him or create a spectacle. That would have been too easy for Richard to call persecution. Instead, two senior security officers entered quietly with Elaine's written authorization and asked for his company phone, his tablet, his executive access card, and the acquisition signing pen still lying near his folder. Richard looked at the pen as if it had betrayed him. Less than an hour earlier, he had planned to use it to seal his legacy. Now it was being placed in an evidence bag because the company needed to preserve everything connected to the interrupted vote. Malcolm watched without satisfaction. His mother had not raised him to enjoy humiliation. She had raised him to understand consequence. Richard slowly removed the access card from his jacket pocket and set it on the table. The soft plastic click sounded louder than it should have. The board secretary documented the time. Elaine collected his devices with gloved care, not because anyone expected drama, but because chain of custody mattered. Malcolm had made sure of that. Clean records. Clean process. No shortcuts for Richard to attack later. Richard's final attempt came at the door. He turned back toward the board, his face flushed, his voice lower now, almost pleading beneath the anger. Everything I built, all of this, every one of you benefited from it. Helen answered, that is why we have to know what it was built on. He looked at Malcolm last. For the first time, there was no practiced smile, no executive polish, no generous public mask. Only resentment. You think this makes you my son? Malcolm held his gaze. No. Naomi Carter made me her son. This only makes you accountable. Richard had no reply strong enough to survive the room. He left escorted by security, not in handcuffs, not as a criminal dragged from a scene, but as something almost worse to a man like him, a chief executive officer removed from his own boardroom by the rules he thought were written for other people. The glass doors closed behind him. The room exhaled. But the payoff did not stop at removal. Within 2 hours, Whitmore Holdings issued a carefully worded public statement announcing that Richard Whitmore had been placed on administrative leave pending an independent investigation into historical executive conduct and document preservation concerns. The acquisition vote was postponed indefinitely. Trading analysts began calling. Business reporters who had received Richard's planted rumor now had a far more serious story. By sunset, the online item questioning Malcolm's motives had been updated with a note that the board had opened an investigation and that Northbridge had provided documentary evidence. The narrative Richard tried to poison turned back on him. By the next morning, the headline was everywhere in Atlanta business circles: Whitmore Holdings suspends chief executive officer amid governance investigation. No one printed every private detail at first, because Malcolm and Northbridge insisted the process protect Naomi's dignity and witness privacy. But Naomi's name entered the official record exactly as Malcolm had promised. Not as gossip. Not as a scandalous whisper. As a woman whose employment, termination, and silencing were now tied to board action, financial review, and executive accountability. Independent counsel sent preservation notices to Elaine Porter, Mrs. Whitcomb, Richard's executive assistant, archival vendors, communications staff, and former officers who might have knowledge of the old payments. The forensic accountants froze the historical account categories connected to executive risk and legal containment. The communications director was questioned about the planted media narrative. The private investigator who had visited Grace Miller's neighborhood was identified through license plate footage and required to produce his engagement records. Grace was assigned witness counsel paid through an independent protection fund established by the board, not controlled by Richard. David Lang provided sworn testimony that the suspicious routing sheets had existed and that concerns had been minimized at the time. Mrs. Whitcomb, long retired and living in a gated retirement community north of the city, tried to say she remembered very little. Then independent counsel showed her Naomi's termination notice, Grace's statement, the staff log, and the unsigned agreement. Memory, like courage, sometimes improves when perjury becomes possible. She admitted that Richard's office had instructed her to remove Naomi from the household immediately after the pregnancy disclosure and that misconduct language had been added after the fact to protect the family. That statement did not heal what Naomi had endured, but it shattered the lie that Naomi had been dismissed for cause. The company corrected its internal record. Naomi Carter's employment file, once marked by false suspicion and sealed in shame, was amended to state that her termination had been improperly handled, retaliatory in nature, and unsupported by the misconduct claims used against her. Malcolm received the certified correction in a plain envelope 3 weeks after the board meeting. He carried it to Naomi's apartment and placed it on the kitchen table beside the old manila folder. Naomi was thinner now, wrapped in a blue shawl, sitting where she had once sorted bills while Malcolm did homework. Her hands trembled slightly when she lifted the page. She read the first line, stopped, and pressed her fingers to her mouth. For 25 years, Richard's version had followed her quietly through closed doors, missing references, cautious interviews, and the private humiliation of knowing a lie had been written where her work history should have been clean. Now the company that helped bury that lie had been forced to correct it. "They wrote it down," she whispered. Malcolm sat beside her. "Yes. Not just you saying it. No. Them." Her eyes filled, but she did not break. Naomi Carter had already survived the worst day they made for her. This was not rescue. This was restoration. At Whitmore Holdings, the investigation widened. Richard was forced to resign before the board could vote on permanent removal, but the resignation did not save him from consequences. His exit package was suspended pending findings. Performance bonuses tied to the delayed acquisition were frozen. His ability to serve on affiliated boards was restricted by emergency governance clauses. The company referred the document disposal instruction and possible misuse of corporate funds to outside authorities and regulators for review. Civil litigation followed from shareholders who argued that Richard's concealment had exposed the company to financial risk. Former domestic workers and lower-level employees who had signed questionable non-disclosure agreements began contacting counsel. Some had stories unrelated to Naomi, but connected by the same machinery: pressure, silence, payments, reputation management, and workers told they should be grateful for being allowed near wealth. Richard's name remained on buildings for a while because stone changes slower than truth, but invitations stopped. Panels were cancelled. Charities quietly removed him from advisory boards. The magazine profile titled "The Legacy Builder" never ran. Malcolm refused every private settlement offer that required confidentiality about Naomi. Elaine Porter, facing her own professional review, sent one final message through counsel proposing a confidential family resolution. Malcolm rejected it in writing with one sentence: "Naomi Carter's dignity is not a private liability to be settled in silence." Instead, he negotiated a public corrective action package tied to the board investigation. Whitmore Holdings would fund an independent legal aid initiative for domestic workers, caregivers, cleaners, and low-wage employees facing retaliation or coercive non-disclosure agreements. The company would audit old settlements. It would establish an employee reporting channel outside executive control. It would require board review of any legal expense involving personal misconduct by senior officers. And the initiative would carry Naomi's name only if she approved. Malcolm brought her the proposal on a quiet evening when rain tapped softly against the apartment window, not the violent rain of the day she was pushed out, but a gentler rain, the kind that washes dust from sidewalks. Naomi read the document slowly. "He loses the company?" she asked. "He loses control of it," Malcolm said. "He loses the deal. He loses the story he told about you. He loses the protection he thought money guaranteed. The rest will continue through the investigation. And you?" "I keep my name." She looked up at him. "You always had your name." Malcolm nodded. "Because you gave it to me." Naomi looked back at the proposal, at the letter spelling Naomi Carter Legal Aid Fund, and for a long time she said nothing. Then she touched the page with 2 fingers, as if testing whether it was real. "I do not want my pain turned into decoration," she said. "It will not be. I want it to help women who clean rooms where no one looks them in the eye. That is what it is for." Naomi closed her eyes. Then yes. The payoff was not a single fall from a chair. It was a sequence of doors closing on Richard Whitmore and opening for the people he had believed would never be heard. He lost his title. He lost the acquisition. He lost board protection. He lost control of the evidence. He lost the ability to call Naomi a liar without facing documents that proved otherwise. And Naomi, who had once walked half a mile to a bus stop in the rain carrying an unsigned agreement meant to erase her, finally received what he had denied her from the beginning: her name restored, her truth entered into the record, and her son standing beside her without needing anything from the man who abandoned them. The first week after Richard Whitmore's resignation felt strange because the city kept moving as if nothing had happened, yet inside certain rooms, people were no longer able to pretend they did not know. Elevators still carried executives up the glass tower. Assistants still arranged meetings. Contracts still crossed desks. But the air inside Whitmore Holdings had changed. Workers who once lowered their voices near senior offices began speaking more carefully, not with fear this time, but with the awareness that records mattered and silence was no longer the safest language. The new interim chief executive officer, Helen Brooks, announced an independent workplace accountability review across every division of the company, including domestic services, executive residences, private event staff, drivers, cleaners, caregivers, and temporary workers who had never been included in corporate protection policies before. For the first time, the company admitted publicly that people who worked closest to power were often the least protected from it. That sentence appeared in an internal memorandum and spread through staff phones before lunch. Some employees read it twice because they had never seen a corporation say something so plain. The Naomi Carter Legal Aid Fund opened in a modest community center on the west side of Atlanta, not in a marble lobby or a hotel ballroom. Naomi had insisted on that. She said women who needed help should not have to walk into a building designed to remind them they had no money. On the first day, Malcolm stood beside a folding table while volunteers arranged pamphlets about wage theft, retaliation, coercive non-disclosure agreements, pregnancy discrimination, and worker rights. A retired housekeeper arrived with a folder of old pay records. A caregiver came with text messages from an employer who threatened to ruin her references. A hotel cleaner brought her daughter to translate, then cried when she learned translation services would be provided free. None of their stories were identical to Naomi's, but the pattern was familiar. Enough to make Malcolm's chest tighten. Powerful people had counted on each woman feeling alone. Naomi's name on the wall made that loneliness harder to maintain. Grace Miller came to the opening wearing a lavender church hat and carrying a purse full of peppermints. When the volunteers applauded her, she shook her head and said, "Do not clap because I waited so long. Help the next woman sooner." That line became the spirit of the fund. David Lang attended quietly, standing near the back, not seeking forgiveness from anyone. He had given his statement, surrendered his copies, and agreed to speak at corporate ethics trainings about the cost of looking away. The first time he stood before a room of finance officers and said, "I mistook discomfort for innocence, and that mistake protected a lie," no one checked their phone. At Whitmore Holdings, the changes became concrete. Any legal expense involving a senior executive's private conduct now required review by an independent ethics committee. Non-disclosure agreements could no longer be used to conceal misconduct, retaliation, pregnancy-related discrimination, or abuse of authority. Household employees connected to executive residences were reclassified under formal workplace protection policies, with access to human resources, outside counsel, and anonymous reporting. Archived settlement files were audited by a law firm that did not answer to Richard or Elaine Porter. More than a dozen old cases were reopened. Some ended in corrected employment records. Some led to compensation. Some simply gave former workers what Naomi had once needed most, a written acknowledgement that they had not imagined what happened to them. Mrs. Whitcomb, after giving her statement, sent Naomi a letter of apology through counsel. It was careful, late, and not enough. Naomi read it once, folded it, and placed it in the back of the old folder. She did not perform forgiveness for anyone's comfort. "People always want mercy after the truth has witnesses," she told Malcolm. Let her live with what she finally admitted. Malcolm nodded because he understood. Justice did not require Naomi to soften the edges of her pain so others could feel redeemed. Richard's fall also changed the way Atlanta's business community spoke about reputation. At first, some executives whispered that the board had overreacted, that old personal matters should not destroy a career. Then the investigation summaries began circulating privately among legal departments and investment groups, and the whispers quieted. It was not old pain that had destroyed Richard. It was the current cover-up, the witness pressure, the file movement, the arrogance of believing a company existed to protect one man's secrets. Business schools used the case in governance seminars without naming every private detail. Law students debated it as an example of how personal misconduct becomes corporate liability when power, money, and silence intersect. Malcolm did not chase interviews, but when he did speak publicly, he kept returning to the same point: the issue was never whether a rich man had a complicated past. The issue was whether systems would keep helping rich men bury the people they harmed. Naomi lived long enough to visit the community center once. Malcolm drove her there on a clear Saturday morning, helping her from the car as sunlight warmed the sidewalk. She moved slowly, but her eyes were bright. Inside, she saw a young black woman in a work uniform sitting with a volunteer attorney, documents spread between them, shoulders relaxing as someone finally listened without judgment. Naomi stopped in the doorway and held Malcolm's arm. "That was all I wanted," she said softly. "For somebody to listen before the damage was done." Malcolm looked at the room, at the women with folders, the volunteers with notebooks, the wall where his mother's name stood in simple letters, and he realized the victory had grown beyond the boardroom. Richard had lost power, but Naomi had gained reach. Her dignity was no longer locked inside an envelope under a floorboard. It had become a door other people could walk through before it was too late. Malcolm Carter returned to the old apartment on a Sunday evening, the same hour when his mother used to set beans on the stove, fold clinic uniforms over the back of a chair, and ask him whether his homework was finished before he could ask for television. The city outside had changed in ways both obvious and invisible. New buildings rose where old stores had been. Traffic moved faster along streets that once carried him to school on slow buses. But inside the apartment, time still lived in small objects: the chipped blue mug Naomi liked, the kitchen table where she had sorted bills, the faded curtain she kept because she said sunlight did not need expensive fabric to be beautiful. Naomi had passed quietly 3 months after the opening of the legal aid fund, not in fear, not in shame, but with Malcolm beside her, her hand resting in his, her name already restored in records that once tried to erase her. She had lived long enough to see the first women walk through the doors of the center bearing her name. She had lived long enough to know Richard Whitmore no longer controlled the story. That was the mercy Malcolm carried with him now. On the table before him lay the old manila envelope, no longer hidden beneath a floorboard, no longer sealed like a wound. Beside it was a framed photograph of Naomi at 24, standing in a plain dress outside the community college library, eyes bright, shoulders straight, looking like a woman who had every reason to be tired and still chose hope. Malcolm placed 3 things beside the photograph. The first was the certified correction from Whitmore Holdings clearing her employment record. The second was the public announcement of the Naomi Carter Legal Aid Fund's first full year of grants. The third was a simple bronze nameplate from the center's new office door, replaced after the foundation expanded into a larger space. He touched the nameplate with 2 fingers. Naomi Carter. For years, that name had lived in whispers, in old paperwork, in the careful memory of a woman who cleaned rooms where no one thought she mattered. Now it was on legal forms, community walls, training materials, scholarship checks, and letters mailed to workers who needed someone to believe them before the damage became permanent. Malcolm sat in a chair across from where his mother used to sit and let the quiet come. He did not feel triumphant. Triumph was too loud for what Naomi had taught him. He felt something steadier, something closer to peace. Richard Whitmore was still alive somewhere behind gated walls and legal statements, stripped of the company that once made his voice larger than everyone else's. There were still investigations, settlements, hearings, and lawyers speaking in careful sentences. But Malcolm no longer measured justice by how much Richard lost. That had never been the whole point. The point was that Naomi had been heard. The point was that her son had walked into the room built to exclude her and placed her name where the minutes could not ignore it. The point was that other women no longer had to carry their evidence alone for 25 years, hoping someday someone would be strong enough to open the folder. Malcolm opened the old envelope one last time. The papers inside were fragile now, softened at the edges by time and handling, the termination notice, the unsigned agreement, Grace Miller's note, the medical record, the staff log, the documents that had crossed decades to reach a boardroom. He did not see only pain in them anymore. He saw his mother's discipline. He saw her refusal to let shame become truth. He saw every night she worked tired, every morning she still made breakfast, every lesson she gave him about reading before signing, standing straight, keeping copies, and letting truth lead anger instead of the other way around. Outside, sunset filled the apartment with gold. Malcolm stood, carried the envelope to a small archival box, and closed the lid gently. Not to bury it. To preserve it properly. Then he looked at his mother's photograph and spoke the words he had wanted to say since the day he first entered that boardroom. "They heard you, Mom." The room did not answer, but it did not need to. The answer was in the corrected record. It was in Grace's courage. It was in the women waiting at the legal aid center with folders in their hands and hope returning slowly to their faces. It was in the fact that Malcolm Carter did not need Richard's name, approval, apology, or inheritance to know who he was. Naomi had given him something stronger than a father's recognition. She had given him a life built on dignity. And in the end, the rich man who tried to make her disappear became a cautionary footnote, while the woman he abandoned became a doorway for others to walk through with their heads held high.